The summer heat of 1882 hung over Redemption Creek like a suffocating blanket. Dust swirled through the wooden slats of McKenna's trading post, where the monthly auction drew men from 3 counties. The air reeked of unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, and something darker, the stench of human greed. Sarah Chen stood on the makeshift platform, her hands bound, dark eyes fixed on a point beyond the leering crowd. At 19, she'd already endured more than most would in a lifetime. Her Chinese mother's delicate features mixed with her Irish father's strong jaw, creating a beauty that had become both blessing and curse in this lawless territory. "What am I bid for this fine specimen?" Auctioneer Jeremiah McKenna's voice boomed over the crowd. "Healthy as a horse, knows her letters, and look at those hands, built for hard work." The bidding started at $50. The crowd of ranchers, merchants, and drifters called out amounts with the casual indifference of men buying livestock. Sarah's stomach churned as the price climbed. $75, then $90. $100, shouted Dutch Morrison, a cattle baron whose reputation for cruelty preceded him wherever he rode. His gold teeth gleamed as he grinned. "She'll make a fine addition to my household staff." The crowd erupted in knowing laughter. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the last fragments of hope crumble like desert sand. Then the saloon doors burst open. The laughter died instantly. Every head turned toward the figure silhouetted against the blazing afternoon sun. Spurs clinked against weathered floorboards as the man stepped inside, his shadow stretching across the room like a dark promise. Jesse Calhoun was a name whispered in equal parts fear and respect from Tucson to Santa Fe. 6 feet of lean muscle wrapped in a black duster, his face bore the kind of scars that told stories without words. A Colt .45 hung low on his hip, its worn grip testament to years of survival in places where mercy was a luxury few could afford. The crowd parted as he moved through them, boot heels striking the floor with measured precision. Sarah opened her eyes and found herself staring into a face that seemed carved from granite. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw darkened by 3 days of stubble, and eyes the color of storm clouds. "Am I too late for the bidding?" Jesse's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. McKenna cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Calhoun, we weren't expecting—" "The bidding," Jesse repeated, his hand resting casually near his gun. "Is it still open?" Yes, sir. Current bid stands at $100. Jesse studied Sarah for a long moment. Something flickered in his grey eyes. Recognition of pain that mirrored his own, perhaps, or simply the understanding of what it meant to be trapped with no way out. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a crumpled bill. Without taking his eyes off Sarah, he held it up. $1. The silence that followed was deafening. Dutch Morrison's face flushed red. "You can't bid lower than the current." $1, Jesse said again, louder this time. His voice carried the quiet authority of a man who'd stared death in the face so many times they were old acquaintances. "For her freedom," McKenna stammered. That's not how auctions work, Mr. Calhoun. The bid has to be higher than—" The distinctive sound of a hammer being pulled back echoed through the room. Jesse hadn't drawn his gun, but every man present could hear it clear as church bells. "I said $1. Jesse's words were soft as velvet and twice as deadly. "For her freedom, not her service, not her labor, her freedom." Dutch Morrison started to protest, but found himself staring down the barrel of Jesse's Colt. When had the outlaw drawn it? Nobody had seen him move. "You got a problem with that arrangement, Dutch?" The cattle baron's hand hovered near his own weapon, but common sense won out over pride. Everyone knew Jesse Calhoun had put 6 men in the ground just last month in Tombstone, and they'd all been armed. "No problem," Dutch muttered, stepping back. Jesse holstered his gun and approached the platform. Sarah watched him climb the steps, her heart hammering against her ribs. Up close, she could see the weariness etched into his features, the kind that came from carrying too much pain for too long. He pulled out a knife and cut her bonds with quick, efficient movements. As the rope fell away, their eyes met properly for the first time. "You're free," he said simply. Sarah rubbed her wrists where the rope had chafed, hardly daring to believe it. "Why?" Jessie glanced at the crowd of hostile faces surrounding them, then back at her. "Sometimes $1 spent right is worth more than 100 spent wrong." As they walked toward the doors together, the only sound was the whisper of wind through the wooden slats and the soft jingle of Jessie's spurs. Outside, 2 horses waited, a black stallion that looked as untamed as its owner and a gentle brown mare. The outlaw who'd bought her freedom for $1 handed her the mare's reins. "Where will you go?" he asked. Sarah looked out at the endless expanse of desert, then back at the man who'd just changed her life. "I don't know." Jessie mounted his stallion, the leather creaking under his weight. "There's a town called Haven's Rest, about 2 days' ride north. Good people there. They don't ask too many questions. What about you?" He studied her face in the dying light, something unreadable flickering in his storm-grey eyes. "I ride alone, miss. Always have." But as he turned to go, Sarah called out, "My name is Sarah." "Sarah Chen." Jessie paused, his hand resting on his saddle horn. "Jessie Calhoun. I know who you are." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Then you know you're better off without me." As his horse disappeared into the gathering dusk, Sarah remained standing beside the trading post, clutching the reins of her new freedom. In her pocket was the single dollar bill Jessie had dropped, the price of her liberation, and perhaps the beginning of something neither of them could have imagined. The first chapter had ended, but the story was just beginning. 2 days on the trail had taught Sarah Chen that freedom tasted like dust and uncertainty. The brown mare Jessie had given her, she'd named her Liberty, moved steadily through the scrubland toward Haven's Rest. But every mile brought new doubts. What would she do when she arrived? How would she survive in a world that saw her mixed heritage as either exotic curiosity or unwelcome complication? The sun hung low over the red rock formations when Sarah spotted the smoke. 3 riders emerged from behind a cluster of boulders, blocking the narrow canyon pass ahead. She recognized the leader immediately, Dutch Morrison, his gold teeth catching the dying light as he grinned. The 2 men flanking him looked like the kind who'd sell their own mothers for whiskey money. "Well, well," Dutch called out, spurring his horse closer. "If it isn't our little runaway. Seems to me we got some unfinished business, sweetheart." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to the small knife Jessie had given her. Hardly enough against 3 armed men, but better than nothing. "I'm a free woman now. You heard what happened at the auction. That outlaw ain't here to protect you now," Dutch sneered. "And I got witnesses here who'll swear you stole that horse. Horse thieving's a hanging offense in these parts." The 2 gunmen spread out, cutting off any escape route. Sarah's heart hammered as she realized the truth. Jessie had been right about one thing. In this harsh land, freedom was only as strong as your ability to defend it. "Please," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" Dutch laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Honey, trouble found you the day you were born looking like you do. Now climb down nice and easy and we'll discuss your employment options." That's when the first shot rang out. The bullet struck the rock inches from Dutch's head, sending stone fragments flying. All 3 men wheeled around, hands moving toward their guns, as a familiar figure emerged from the high ground behind them. Jessie Calhoun sat astride his black stallion like an angel of vengeance, rifle steady in his hands. In the 2 days since the auction, he'd clearly been following at a distance, close enough to help, far enough to maintain the illusion that he rode alone. "Dutch," Jessie's voice carried easily across the canyon, "seems like you didn't learn your lesson back in Redemption Creek." "Calhoun." Dutch's face flushed red with rage and embarrassment. "This ain't your concern anymore. You bought her, you set her free. That makes her fair game." "Wrong." Jessie's rifle swung to cover Dutch's heart. "That makes her under my protection." The tension stretched taut as a piano wire. Sarah watched Jessie's face, seeing something she hadn't noticed before, Beneath the hard mask of the gunfighter was a man who understood exactly what it meant to be powerless, to be treated as less than human. "You gonna take on all three of us for some half-breed gal?" one of Dutch's men called out, his hand hovering over his pistol. The words hit Jesse like a physical blow. Sarah saw his jaw clench, saw something dark and dangerous flicker in his storm-grey eyes. "Her name," Jesse said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried farther than a shout, "is Sarah Chen, and any man who can't show proper respect to a lady is gonna answer to me." The standoff stretched for heartbeats that felt like hours. 3 against 1, but everyone in that canyon knew Jesse Calhoun's reputation. Quick as lightning, deadly accurate, and absolutely without fear when protecting what mattered to him. Dutch's nerve broke first. "This ain't over, Calhoun," he snarled, but he was already backing his horse away. "That gal's gonna bring you nothing but trouble." "Maybe," Jesse replied, never moving his rifle. "But that's my choice to make." The 3 riders retreated, but not before Dutch called back one final threat. "Every bounty hunter from here to California knows your face, Calhoun. Adding her to your problems ain't gonna help your longevity." When the dust settled and they were alone again, Jesse rode down to where Sarah waited. She noticed his hands were perfectly steady as he slid the rifle back into its scabbard, but something in his eyes had changed. "Thought you said you rode alone," Sarah said softly. Jesse dismounted and checked her horse's hooves with professional efficiency, avoiding her gaze. "I do. This was just coincidence. Coincidence that you happened to be following the same trail for 2 days." He straightened, finally meeting her eyes. "You ever been to California, Miss Chen?" The change of subject was abrupt, but Sarah sensed this was important. "No. Why?" "Got a friend there. Runs a newspaper in San Francisco. Good man, doesn't care what color a person is or where they come from. He could use someone who knows their letters." Sarah stared at him. "You're offering me a job?" "In California." "I'm offering you a chance," Jesse corrected. "California's a big place, room for folks to start over, be whoever they want to be." "And what about you?" Jesse walked to his horse, his movements careful and deliberate. "I told you before, I ride alone. But you just said I was under your protection. Protection ends when I get you somewhere safe." His voice was gruff, but Sarah caught the uncertainty underneath. "California's safe. For people like you. People like you." The word stung, even though she understood what he meant. Mixed race, vulnerable, caught between worlds. But as she studied Jesse's face in the gathering twilight, she began to wonder if maybe they weren't so different after all. "What about people like you?" she asked quietly. Jesse's hand stilled on his saddle. For a moment the mask slipped completely, and Sarah saw the loneliness that lived behind his grey eyes, the kind of bone-deep solitude that came from years of believing you didn't deserve companionship. "People like me don't get happy endings, Miss Chen." As they made camp that night under a canopy of desert stars, Sarah found herself watching Jesse move around the small fire. He was efficient, economical in his movements, like a man accustomed to traveling light and trusting no one. But when he thought she wasn't looking, she caught him studying her with an expression she couldn't quite name. "Jesse," she said, as he settled against his saddle with a cup of coffee. "Yes, ma'am?" "Thank you. For today. For everything." He nodded once, then stared into the flames. "Get some rest. We've got hard riding ahead if we're going to make it to California." Sarah pulled her blanket closer and closed her eyes, but sleep was a long time coming. Because somewhere between the auction house and this moment under the stars, she'd begun to suspect that Jesse Calhoun's story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. And maybe, just maybe, hers was too. The town of Cedar Falls hadn't changed much in 5 years. Jesse Calhoun sat his horse on the ridge overlooking the valley, watching smoke curl from chimneys he recognized, seeing faces that belonged to a life he'd tried to forget. Beside him, Sarah waited patiently, sensing the weight of whatever memories held him frozen in place. "We could go around," she offered quietly. "Find another route to California." Jesse's jaw tightened. "No." We're low on supplies, and there's a water shortage ahead. This is the only settlement for 50 miles. He paused, his storm-grey eyes fixed on the church steeple. Besides, running from ghosts never made them go away. As they rode down the main street, Jesse pulled his hat low over his eyes, but recognition was inevitable in a town this small. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Shopkeepers paused in their doorways. Children were quietly called inside. Sarah felt the weight of their stares, but noticed something else. Beneath the fear was respect, and in some faces, something that looked almost like relief. They stopped at Henderson's general store, where Margaret Henderson stood behind the counter, her grey hair pulled back in the same severe bun Jesse remembered from his childhood. She looked up as they entered, and her weathered face went through a series of emotions: shock, joy, then careful wariness. "Jesse Calhoun," she said softly. "Never thought I'd see you darken this doorway again." "Mrs. Henderson," Jesse touched his hat brim respectfully. "Need supplies for the trail, can pay cash." The older woman's eyes shifted to Sarah, taking in her mixed heritage with the careful assessment of someone who'd lived through decades of frontier prejudice. But there was kindness there too, and recognition of a fellow survivor. "You're welcome here, child," Margaret said to Sarah, then looked back at Jesse. "Both of you are." As Margaret gathered their supplies, the store's back door opened and a man emerged from the shadows, tall, silver-haired, wearing a sheriff's badge that caught the afternoon light. Sarah tensed, but Jesse's hand moved away from his gun instead of toward it. "Hello, Pa," Jesse said quietly. Sheriff Thomas Calhoun looked older than his 55 years, worn down by the weight of wearing a badge in a lawless territory. His eyes, the same storm grey as his son's, studied Jesse with a mixture of pain and stubborn love. "Son." The word carried 5 years of unspoken conversations. "Heard you were in the territory. Hoped you might—" "Just passing through," Jesse interrupted, but his voice lacked its usual edge. Sarah watched the interaction with growing understanding. This wasn't the homecoming of a man ashamed of his past. This was the careful dance of two people who'd hurt each other and didn't know how to bridge the gap. "Sheriff Calhoun," Sarah said, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah Chen. Your son saved my life." Thomas took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle. "Ma'am, and knowing Jesse, I'm sure there's more to that story than he's telling." Before Jesse could respond, the store's front door burst open. A young man stumbled in, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, his face pale with terror. "Sheriff," he gasped, "the Garrett gang, they hit the bank, took Mrs. Patterson and her little girl as hostages." The name hit Jesse like a physical blow. Sarah saw him go rigid, saw something dangerous wake up behind his eyes. "How many?" Thomas asked, already checking his rifle. "6, maybe 7. They're holed up in the old mine shaft up Devil's Canyon. Said they'll kill the hostages if anyone follows." Thomas turned to his son, and in that moment the years fell away. Jesse wasn't the notorious outlaw anymore. He was just a young man who'd once worn a deputy's badge with pride before the world went wrong. "I could use your help," Thomas said simply. Jesse looked at Sarah, conflict clear on his face. She stepped closer, her voice low but firm. "Go," she said. "Do what needs doing." "It's not your fight," Jesse protested. But Sarah could see he was already making his choice. "Those people are innocent, just like I was innocent." She touched his arm, feeling the tension coiled there like a spring. "You didn't turn away from me. Don't turn away from them." Margaret Henderson watched the exchange with sharp eyes. "I'll look after the girl," she said. "Sarah's welcome to stay here until you get back." Jesse studied Sarah's face, seeing the strength there, the kind that had helped her survive years of bondage and now gave her the courage to send him into danger. "The Garrett gang," he said to his father. "They're not just bank robbers, they're killers. Billy Garrett's been nursing a grudge against this town since you ran him out 3 years ago." Thomas nodded grimly. "Which is why I need someone who thinks like they do, someone who's lived in that world and knows how to survive it." As the two men prepared to leave, Sarah caught Jesse's arm. "Come back to me," she said simply. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to face. Jesse's hand covered hers, his thumb tracing across her knuckles. "Sarah, I know," she interrupted. "You ride alone, but not today. Today you ride for them and for me." Outside, father and son mounted their horses in the gathering dusk. As they rode toward Devil's Canyon, Thomas spoke without looking at his son. "She's good for you." "It's not like that," Jesse replied, but the words lacked conviction. "Son, I've watched you carry guilt and anger for 5 years. First time I've seen you look at another person the way you looked at that girl." Jesse was quiet for a long moment, listening to the rhythm of hoofbeats on hard-packed earth. "She deserves better than an outlaw with a price on his head. Maybe. Or maybe she deserves the chance to decide for herself what she wants." As they approached the canyon, Jesse's hand instinctively checked his guns, but for the first time in years, he wasn't riding toward violence with emptiness in his heart. He was riding toward it with something to lose, and paradoxically, that made him more dangerous than he'd ever been, because Jesse Calhoun had finally found something worth protecting, something worth coming home to. And he'd be damned if he was going to let Billy Garrett take that away from him. The rescue mission that followed would test everything Jesse had learned about survival, about family, and about the difference between being an outlaw and being a hero. But in that moment, riding beside his father under a canopy of desert stars, Jesse Calhoun felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 long years. He felt like he was exactly where he belonged. The Pacific wind carried the scent of salt and possibility through the open windows of the San Francisco Chronicle's newsroom. Sarah Chen Calhoun sat at her writing desk, ink-stained fingers dancing across the typewriter keys as she crafted her latest article about the changing demographics of California's mining towns. Around her, the newsroom buzzed with the controlled chaos of deadline day, reporters shouting questions across the room, editors marking up copy with red ink, and the constant clatter of the printing press from the floor below. "Mrs. Calhoun," called out editor Harrison Webb from his glass-walled office. "Magnificent piece on the Chinese workers' strike in Sacramento. Front-page material." Sarah smiled, still surprised after a year of marriage to hear her new name spoken with such respect. In San Francisco, her mixed heritage was viewed as an asset rather than a liability, the city's cosmopolitan nature embracing diversity in ways the frontier towns never could. Her articles on immigrant communities, labor disputes, and social reform had quickly established her as one of the Chronicle's most valuable reporters. But more than professional success, Sarah had found something she'd never dared dream of during those dark years of bondage, a sense of belonging. She belonged to this bustling, ever-changing city. She belonged to the newspaper family that had welcomed her with open arms. And most importantly, she belonged to the quiet, steady man who came home to her each evening, hanging his deputy marshal's badge on the kitchen table alongside her reporter's notebook. The newsroom's front door opened with its familiar jingle, and Sarah looked up to see Jesse entering, still wearing his dark coat and the silver badge that marked him as one of Federal Marshal Sullivan's most trusted deputies. Even after a year in San Francisco, Jesse moved through crowds like a man accustomed to watching shadows, but the hard edges that had once defined him had softened considerably. "Mrs. Calhoun," he said formally, touching his hat brim with mock formality, "might I escort you home? I believe we have dinner plans." Sarah's co-workers had long since stopped being surprised by the sight of the former outlaw who came to collect his wife each evening. Jesse's reputation as Deputy Marshal Calhoun was already becoming legendary in its own right. His knowledge of criminal psychology and outlaw tactics had helped capture some of California's most wanted men. But where once he'd used violence as his primary tool, now he relied on understanding, negotiation, and when necessary, his still formidable skill with a gun used only in defense of the innocent. "Just finishing up," Sarah replied, pulling the final sheet from her typewriter. Harrison wants the story about the dock workers' union ready for tomorrow's edition. Ooh. As she gathered her things, Editor Webb approached them both. Jessie, I've been meaning to thank you again for that tip about the smuggling operation. 3 arrests made, and the Chronicle had the exclusive story. Jessie nodded, uncomfortable as always with praise. Just doing my job, Mr. Webb. Both of you are doing remarkable work, Webb continued. Sarah's articles are changing how people think about immigration and labor rights. And Jessie, your success rate in bringing in wanted men without bloodshed is unprecedented. You're both making this city safer and more enlightened. Outside, the December evening painted San Francisco's rolling hills in shades of gold and purple. Jessie and Sarah walked arm in arm through the cobblestone streets, past gas lamps already flickering to life, and vendors calling out their evening wares. Their small apartment overlooked Portsmouth Square, where Chinese and Irish immigrants mingled with native-born Americans in a cultural tapestry that would have been impossible in the territories they'd left behind. Letter came today, Jessie said as they climbed the stairs to their second-floor flat. From Pa. Sarah felt her heart skip. They exchanged letters with Sheriff Thomas Calhoun every few weeks, but something in Jessie's tone suggested this one was different. Inside their cozy apartment, furnished with wedding gifts from the newspaper staff and Jessie's fellow marshals, Jessie handed her the envelope. Sarah recognized Thomas's careful handwriting immediately. Dear Jessie and Sarah, the letter began, I hope this finds you both well and happy in your new life. Things here in Cedar Falls continue much the same, though I'm pleased to report that the Garrett Gang's associates have finally moved on to easier pickings elsewhere. I write today with news that I think will interest you both. Young Emma Patterson, the little girl you saved from the mine, has been asking about you constantly. She's been telling everyone who'll listen about the angel man who saved her and her mother. Her teacher says she's writing a composition about heroes for the school Christmas program, and apparently you feature prominently, son. But here's the remarkable part. Emma's story has inspired something beautiful in our little town. Margaret Henderson has started what she calls the Dollar Fund, a collection to help people in desperate circumstances like Sarah once was. They've already helped 2 families escape debt bondage and provided money for a widow to keep her farm. Emma insisted they call it the Dollar Fund because, as she puts it, sometimes $1 spent right is worth more than 100 spent wrong. I thought you'd want to know that your actions that day continue to ripple outward, creating good in the world in ways you probably never imagined. The story of how you bought Sarah's freedom for $1 has become something of a local legend, and people are finding their own ways to live up to that example. Also, I wanted you to know that I've been corresponding with Marshal Sullivan about your work there. Your reputation as a lawman is already spreading throughout the territory. Several towns have requested specifically that you be assigned to cases involving hostage situations or dangerous fugitives who might be willing to surrender rather than face you in a gunfight. Sarah, your articles reach us even here in Cedar Falls. The general store now carries the San Francisco Chronicle, and folks gather each week to hear Margaret read your latest piece aloud. You're helping people understand that the West is changing, becoming more civilized and inclusive. Your words are building bridges between communities that used to view each other with suspicion. I remain proud of you both and grateful for the family I've gained. Your mother would have loved Sarah, Jessie, her strength, her kindness, her determination to make the world better through her words. With love and respect, your father, Thomas Calhoun, P.S. Margaret asks me to tell you that you're welcome home any time and that she's keeping the spare room ready just in case. She's also started a correspondence with Sarah about women's suffrage and labor rights, and I believe you found yourself a formidable ally in that arena. Sarah wiped away tears as she finished reading. Jessie sat beside her on their small sofa, his arm around her shoulders, his own eyes suspiciously bright. $1 fund, Sarah whispered. That little girl remembered. Children always remember kindness. Jessie said softly. Maybe because they haven't learned yet to take it for granted. Sarah turned to face him, studying the profile she'd come to love so completely. In the lamplight, she could see traces of the hard man he'd once been, but also the gentle husband, the principled lawman, the protector of the innocent he'd become. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Giving up the outlaw life? Trading your freedom for badges and responsibilities?" Jessie considered the question seriously, as he always did. "I traded one kind of freedom for another," he said finally. "Before, I was free to go anywhere, do anything, but I was trapped by anger and loneliness. Now, I'm bound by law and duty and love, but those bonds set me free to be the man I always wanted to be." He turned to meet her gaze, his storm-grey eyes warm with contentment. "Besides, the most important thing I ever bought for $1 taught me that real freedom isn't about having no ties to anyone. It's about choosing the right ties." Sarah kissed him then, tasting the salt air and the promise of all their tomorrows. Outside their window, San Francisco's lights twinkled like earthbound stars, and somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn announced another arrival to the city of new beginnings. 6 months later, Jessie would be offered the position of Chief Deputy Marshal for Northern California, a role that would allow him to reshape law enforcement practices throughout the region. Sarah would become the Chronicle's first female senior correspondent, covering stories from Sacramento to the Oregon border. And in Cedar Falls, the Dollar Fund would grow into a territory-wide network of assistance for those trapped in desperate circumstances. But on this December evening in 1883, they were simply Jessie and Sarah Calhoun, a former outlaw and a freed woman who'd found in each other the family they'd never dared hope for. They'd proven that redemption was real, that love could transform even the hardest heart, and that sometimes the smallest gesture, a single dollar spent for another's freedom, could change the entire course of 2 lives. As they prepared for bed that night, Sarah placed Thomas's letter carefully in the wooden box where she kept their most precious correspondence. Tomorrow would bring new stories to write, new criminals to apprehend, new ways to make their corner of the world a little more just. But tonight was for gratitude, for quiet love, and for the knowledge that they'd chosen well when they'd chosen each other. The outlaw and the woman he'd freed for $1 had become something neither had imagined possible. They'd become home for each other, and their love had become a beacon of hope for everyone who still believed in second chances and new beginnings. In the end, that single dollar had purchased more than Sarah's freedom. It had bought them both a future worth living.